Good evening and welcome to today's discussion. We're privileged to host this conversation between two very eminent and erudite public intellectuals, Dr. Bibek Debroy and Arun Shourie on preparing for death, which is Mr. Shourie's recently released book. I'm Sucheta Dalal. I'm the trustee of Moneylife Foundation, which is hosting this seminar. I thank Bibek Debroy and Arun Shourie for making time to be with us today for this session. Death is inevitable, and yet most of us are reluctant to face up to it. Some of you may wonder why Moneylife Foundation is hosting this discussion. After all, our primary objective is financial literacy and consumer issues. But then our regulars know that life is part of Moneylife, and that includes thinking about insurance, wills, living wills. You cannot plan for any of these without dealing with your own mortality, isn't it? Mr. Shourie's book examines this issue on a spiritual plane and provides rich food for thought and the soul. Before we start this session, a few rules which we follow very strictly. One, we remain on topic. We don't go beyond the book. We have everybody on mute during the session. We'll unmute you when the Q&A starts. If you press the raise hand button, which will indicate that you have a question. For optimal viewing, please be in speaker mode. That will help you. This meeting is simultaneously live streamed on Facebook and YouTube, and a recording will be available on Moneylife TV's YouTube channel. During the discussion, please use the chat option so that one of my colleagues will get in touch with you. Also remember that your homes and background are visible to all of us in the webinar. If you want to protect your privacy, you may want to stop the video button. You can still see and hear the discussion. Having spelled these rules out, let me make a brief introduction of our guests. Most of you know them and they don't need an introduction still. Mr. Shourie is an editor, prolific writer and a politician. He is the recipient of the Padma Bhushan and the Magsaysay Award. He's best known for the amazing stint as editor of Indian Express, where there was a tremendous amount of investigative journalism during his time. He's been the telecom minister and has headed the disinvestment ministry during the Vajpayee government. Mr. Shourie has published over 20 books on diverse subjects from Ambedkar, gods, and now death. Dr. Bibek Debroy and Mr. Shourie have one thing in common. They're both great scholars, prolific writers with deep and diverse interests, a broad range of issues from mythology to mythology to reforms, law, and economic issues. In fact, Dr. Debroy has written 100 books and a large number of translations, which has got him into the Limca Book of Records in 2019 as the most prolific translator. Dr. Debroy is a Padma Shri awardee, and his translations of Indian texts and his scholarship on Indian mythology is something that everybody admires. He's also one of the Prime Minister's, chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Council. So this is a conversation between Dr. Bibek Debroy and Mr. Arun Shourie. I hand it over to Dr. Debroy. Look forward to this.
Thank you, Sucheta, and thank you, Moneylife, for giving me the opportunity to read this wonderful book that Arun Shourie has written. I would have probably read it in any case, but it is because of this event that I had the opportunity to read it ahead of what would normally have happened. This is the book. For those who have not seen a copy of the book, it's called Preparing for Death. Actually, it's more about preparing for life, but we will come to that later. Preparing for death sounds much more catchy. That cover, if you can see that cover, is of the death of Vali. It is from the Angkor Wat temple. This book, as I just said, is about preparing for death. I think I have read most of the books Arun Shourie has written. I can't say I've read all of them, I've read most of them. And in many, many ways, I found this the most interesting of books that Arun Shourie has ever written. What's this book about? This book has two completely different parts which are neatly interwoven together. It looks at how 5 people coped with death. The Buddha, Sri Ramakrishna, Rashi, Gandhiji, Vinoba Bhave. And there are lessons, one very minor lesson, but let me just sort of needle Sucheta a little bit. A very minor lesson is about writing a will, writing a living will, but that's not the main of the book. Interwoven with what these 5 people have done to face death is Mr. Shourie's own individual experience. For those who don't know, let me also mention that Mr. Shourie has written on some texts of Hinduism earlier. He has written on Sri Ramakrishna and Ramana Maharshi earlier. And he also wrote a book, Does He Know a Mother's Heart? To me, one of the striking features in this book is Does He Know a Mother's Heart was somewhat bitter in tone. This particular book has a message of serenity. It is of someone, an author, an individual who has found that peace inside himself. So the first question I'd like to ask Mr. Shourie, you have spoken a little bit about this in the book itself, of what you personally went through in July 2019. So can we first start with that? Can you please tell us what was that personal experience? Because it is my belief that one does not write a book like this until one goes through a personal experience like this. And by a personal experience, I do not mean his son, his wife, I mean Arun Shourie himself. So can we first start with that?
Probably what you are referring to is my stay in ICU, and which was actually in December. The first symptoms were in July, but in December here in Navasa, walking up an incline, I lost awareness and fell back like a plank on the back of my head. And I had an external injury, but the main problem was that there was an internal bleed in the brain. And therefore, I was carted unconscious to the ICU in Pune, about 50 kilometers from here. And I stayed there. And in one chapter, I describe, the description of the ICU is a very minor part of it, but as to what practices in meditation, which I had done over the preceding 30 years, 35 years, helped me at that time. And I've described those. I can mention one or two, for instance. It was a very noisy place. I would think of ICUs as a very calm place. They should all be open.
Yes, the reason I asked him to elaborate on his personal experience is any brush with death changes an individual. When you are faced, I was about to say that I don't think people write books like these unless they have had a brush with death. And any brush with death changes people. I know that from my own personal experience. And that's the reason I wanted Mr. Shourie to explain what I think was a trigger. What this book does is, as I said earlier, is it goes into the lives of 5 people: the Buddha, Sri Ramakrishna, Ramana Maharshi, Gandhiji, and Vinoba Bhave. And the book tells us how they dealt with the question of death. One of the questions I wanted to ask Mr. Shourie was, why these 5 people? Why not others? Sri Ramakrishna and Ramana Maharshi, as I said, of course, he is written about before. The Buddha, naturally, because those of us who read Arun Shourie know that he's been attracted towards Buddhism. But I wanted to ask him, why specifically Gandhiji, why Vinoba Bhave, why not someone like Swami Vivekananda? It also quotes extensively from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And then he draws out some lessons on what the lives of these individuals have for us as individuals. Drawing on the way these people, these individuals reacted to the issue of death in 2 different places in the book, Mr. Shourie draws out lessons for all of us. So let me quickly read out those lessons, and I'm stating them very, very briefly. So obviously the book has a very rich discussion on each of these. The first lesson is an obvious one, except that we don't accept it readily. Everyone dies. Everyone dies. The second lesson, again, which does not have much to do directly with the title of the book, is that each one of these individuals at various points in time, and he documents this, they face opposition, they face obstacles, they face problems. These are obstacles and problems caused by others. The third lesson is that everyone goes through physical afflictions. What enables them to tolerate these afflictions, the physical afflictions, is faith. And the question that then arises, which is what I hope we will discuss a bit, is what is faith? What exactly is faith? He also says that one of the lessons, which again is an obvious one, that to use his word, that all of these people, the Buddha, Sri Ramakrishna, Ramana Maharshi, Gandhiji, Vinoba Bhave, they were modest, uses the word modesty. Now, modesty in the sense that I will also die. My time on earth is also limited, but regardless of what happens to me, the world will continue to go on. The world has existed without me, the world will continue to exist without me, and therefore in that particular sense I am irrelevant. But going back to the question and quickly, there's one point which he does not elaborate sufficiently, but I think that's an important one. These people often had, Mr. Shourie's back again, often had, he's gone again, often had a premonition of death. When I say a premonition of death, I don't mean a premonition in a physical sense. Obviously, when I'm suffering dreadfully physically, when I'm in ICU, when I know my time has come, those are physical manifestations. But this is a premonition in the sense that my time is determined, and this is the time I shall exit, not because of physical reasons, but because I know it shall be this way.
Okay, can I start answering?
Yes,
some
yes.
of the things that I heard before I go off again. Vivek has raised important points, and I'll go through them quickly before I am switched off again. First is that you see, the trigger is I started this book 2 years ago, so I could not have anticipated my getting brain injury, therefore being in the ICU. So the ICU is just an appendage to the book, and sort of thing put in the end of the chapter as to what lessons which I had listed in the book were helpful to me in a practical situation. But the second thing that Vivek said was, why these five and not, for instance, Swami Vivekananda? Actually, there is a reason for that. I have read 8 volumes of Swamiji's collected works and speeches, but and I don't want to cause any offense. But I find Sri Ramakrishna to be a preponderantly spiritual being, and Swamiji to be preponderantly the person who organized how to carry forward the work. And while he talks a lot about spirituality, he gives us great insights into, let's say, the theory of karma. He gives us some practices in meditation, but it is Sri Ramakrishna as a spiritual figure and Swami Vivekananda as an organizational figure. That's how they seem to me, and that's why I did not take the question of Swami Vivekananda, and also the last phase of Swamiji is not as well documented as in the case of the others. Now, the other question that Vivek was just raising was about premonition. And there are 2 ways to look at it. Even sort of subconsciously, how do they think that their time has come? You see, I think we read into their words retrospectively, a premonition retrospectively rather than at that time. Of course, as let's say Sri Ramakrishna ages and becomes ill because of cancer, the cancer is so troublesome. So it is quite likely that everybody will think that he will be passing away soon. At the end, he was, as he said, bent like a bow, a skeleton bent like a bow. So he could not even get up on his own. And therefore, it was not difficult to anticipate either for him or for others that, yes, the time may be coming. But many of them had set indices for themselves that when, for instance, in Gandhiji's case, that when he used to say that when I lose control over my sleep, I know that my time has come, or when I become irritable. And one day before the 30th, on the 29th, he asks his niece Manu to write down. And she writes. He says, if I die wasting of a disease on a bed, even if it is just a boil, then know me to have been a fraud and proclaim it to the world. But if I die at the hand of an assassin with a ram on my lips, then know me to have made good my claim. Now, it is done one day before the 30th. On the 30th itself, Sardar Patel has come to meet him. The time for his prayer meeting has come. And then, it's very difficult for anybody to interrupt their conversation. But at last, Manu or somebody goes and tells him, Bapu, time ho gaya hai, aap late ho gaya ho, 10 minutes ho gaye hain. He gets up hurriedly. And he says, why aren't you coming? To his niece. She says, but I have to make that paste for your cough. So I'll make it. He said, no, if I come back from the meeting, if I'm still alive, then I'll take it at night. He had a very bad cough at that time. Come along. She says, but she gets up. She says, Mr. Dhebar, UN Dhebar, who later became the Congress president, and so, from Kathiawar. They have come for a meeting. They want time. He said, tell them that if I come back from there, I'll give the time. Now, these are clearly, and within 5 minutes of saying this, he is killed. For less time. But the point is, these are seen to be premonitions. But if you look at the other evidence, it is that there had already been an assault on him, with an attempt on him with a bomb. That Baba had tried to throw a bomb on him. It had landed elsewhere. It could not reach him because Baba could not get through the window, the grenade through the window. Now, as he was the subject of threats, it was quite natural for him to anticipate that he would be killed one day. Similarly, in the case of these meetings, if I come back from the prayer meeting, but at the same time, in the same conversations on the same day, he was planning visits to Wardha for about 15 days, and he wanted to meet the constructive workers in Wardha. He was telling Pyarelal ji, his secretary, that we have to go to Pakistan because I want to show them the real power of non-violence. So those were also plans. So similarly, to take a very small example that I've given, when I started this book 2 years ago, reading about reading the discourses, etc., on death, did I have a premonition that I would live long enough to write the book, or did I have a premonition that my death is close, therefore I better write a book on death? You see, it is difficult to... we read too much retrospectively into words.
Okay, so let me probe that question a little bit more. This all boils down, well, two things. Firstly, some of these people did not always write or compose about what they felt, what their individual experiences were. It was often followers who wrote what they may or may not have experienced, including the Buddha. One of the points you make in the book is many things, and you've given a personal example about that, is many things cannot quite be explained by the usual norms of rationality and evidence that we use to assert that this particular proposition is scientific, it can be derived QED in some sense. You've referred to the Jain practice of Santhara or Salekhana, which is essentially when it is time for me to exit, I exit. In many Hindu texts, there is a reference to Prayopavesha, which essentially means when it is time for me to go, I exit. Vidura is one example of a person who did that from the Mahabharata. So, do you think after what you have read, setting aside the standard norms of rationality tests, there were individuals who had this kind of sense of premonition? Not Gandhiji, but for example, how do you explain Santhara, Salekhana, Prayopavesha, unless people recognize that the time for me to exit has come?
Actually, that is one condition that is laid down, that I come to the realization that my time has come. The other condition may be not that I have become averse to life, not that I now am desperate for death as in suicide, but that I have become totally indifferent to living or dying. And therefore, in many of the Santhara cases, I'm not very familiar with the literature as you are with Mahabharata, but in the Santhara cases, if we see the accounts given of persons, many of them took to that practice, initiated that practice when they were in good health. In the Jain tradition, certainly in those who were this big hill and the small hill. Professor Sitar's volumes are there. They were quite well. So it was not always that they realized that their time has come. They said, my time should come. It's about time that it came. So I am not, I would not put it as a strong condition of taking to that practice or of realizing, but certainly probably ordinary people like us can find that occasion even physically when we become dependent on others, or when we can be kept alive only by artificial means on life support systems. Then certainly if we are aware, mentally still sound, we will know that yes, now more or less my time has come and I should decide whether being restored to what is called life would be of any consequence. And that is an important decision that we should take when we are well, so that we do not burden our relatives with that formidable decision that has to be taken.
I didn't mean it only in the physical sense. The texts often talk about vairagya, which is non-attachment, which is, to use your words, indifference between remaining alive and dying. But let us move on to something else. Having written this book, having read all this, how do you now react to death? Is death something to be mourned? Or since it is inevitable, is it just another stage that all of us pass through? In some form we existed before being born. In some form we will continue to exist after we die. If death is to be mourned, then when we started this, why did Sucheta say good afternoon? There's nothing good about the afternoon, because this simply means that one more afternoon in my life has passed. Why does one celebrate a birthday? Because a birthday simply means that one more day in my life has passed. So the question is, A, how do you look at death? B, is death something to be mourned? And C, if it is inevitable, preparing for death is actually handling life and preparing for life.
First, I think we agree on this. No, but let us say in my own case, or like everybody else, I have had to handle the death of my parents, of many other persons. I've sat through it, sat through their passing away. So certainly, I cannot say that it is a matter of indifference at all. When loved ones pass away, it is a very big loss for those who survive. So I am not, in any great any spiritual height or anything that I can look upon life and death with indifference, as let us say Swami, as Sri Raman Maharishi may be, not Sri Ramakrishna, but Sri Raman Maharishi. Now, I would therefore think that I greatly regret my dying before my wife and son, because I am their principal looker after, and I would be, in spite of all the arrangements that I would have made, I would be I would be desperately worried, even at the last minutes, as to how they would be looked after once I am gone. I would have made all the other arrangements, but still that residual worry would be a big component of my awareness at that time. And the effect that writing this book has had on me, Bibek, is that because for 2 years I was reading about death, therefore it has become a more familiar situation to me. Just that, not that I've become indifferent to life or indifferent to death, but that it is familiar. And I am now sometimes even more worried when I look. I'll give you an example. in the last 10 days, our son had great difficulty in breathing. It's a frightening thing to see somebody who cannot take a breath at any time. And here we are almost 40 kilometers from the nearest medical facility. At that time, I didn't have an oxygen machine for him, so we were really desperate. And the thought in my mind really was that, is this the end? It was, unfortunately, it wasn't. It was just a nasal difficulty he had, and he, because of his handicaps and so on, he's not able to realize what's happening. So because he breathes through his nose, he couldn't breathe. And even by lying down, he became even more uncomfortable. So the thought which would normally not have come to me came immediately. It's not the end, I hope. That desperate feeling. So the occurrence of death now is always in the probability of death, or the imminent possibility of death is now much more in my mind than it would have been 2 years ago. That has been the main effect. And I cannot at all claim that I have become indifferent to death or anything like that. But yes, when I practice meditation, I am more, I'm relating that more, systematically relating it more to what my condition would be in the end.
There's a difference between a lesson and whether I can imbibe the lesson or not. Some of the lessons that we learn from the practices of these people like Ramana Maharshi may be very difficult to imbibe. So is it the case that you're worried about what will happen because of a strong sense of what you yourself and others have called aham, the pride, the arrogance that I will do this, I will do that, while the lessons you have cited say that the world will get on without us and irrelevant. So
Yes.
how do you react to that?
I think that's a very important point. First, yes, it is very difficult to live the lessons which are evident from the lives of from these great lives, even from Gandhiji's life. I mean, but the answer to that is to try and to be what Pyarlalji used to say: "Char ana Gandhi baniye." Do not let the great soul, Mahatma, become a deterrent to your making an effort. Try to be a little bit like him. Even that effort will help. Similarly, in Raman Maharishi's case or Sri Ramakrishna's case, of course, we cannot be like them, but by contemplating their example, their words, their lives, we can try to be a little bit like them. A little bit, even let's say truthful, even a little less full of guile than we would normally be. When we look at Sri Ramakrishna, he's like a child, he's innocent like a child. We should try to imbibe those qualities. In the case of feeling worried, let's say about my wife and son, I would, if I may suggest, I would not think that it is arrogance that, oh, I alone can look after them, as much as it is realism. Howsoever much others, as they are attached to our son and to my wife, her sisters, her brother, her sisters-in-law, my brother and sister, I know that they will do everything they can. Maybe, and in my son's cousins. But I also am realistic enough to see that it does take a lot of time, it does take a lot of emotional energy to look after them. And everybody has his own life to live. The young cousins are at the trajectory of their careers. They have their own little children to look after. They have all their own problems which we have been through, all the opportunities. and the joys. So for me to expect a day to devote as much time and as much emotional energy as is required would be unrealistic. So I would put it to attachment, these two, rather than arrogance, and to realism rather than arrogance, or the feeling of indispensability.
Okay, so now you said something, and it's mentioned in passing in the book, which is that meditation made it easier for you to handle this possibility. What is the meditation you practice? What do you do? How has it helped you? In other words, what I'm trying to say is, while we can learn lessons from the Buddha, Sri Ramakrishna, Ramanama, Sri Gandhiji, and Vinoba Bhave, there are also lessons to be learned from Arun Shourie. So what is the meditation? Can you expand on that? I think it would interest the reader as well as the listener.
As you know, there are, the techniques of meditation are not as different as they are numerous. Everybody will list something or the other, focus on an idol, focus on a mantra, because all those are devices for concentrating the mind and bringing it to one point. And then to notice that one point, notice the noticing of the mind. This is what I have learned. Bibek, this is a point which will be of interest to you. That our mind can think of 1,000 things in succession in 1 minute. But at any one moment, almost by definition, at any one thought moment, it can think of only one thought. That I talked to Bibek. That if I focus on Bibek, at that time, other thoughts are excluded. So the first thing to do is to bring thoughts one point, whether it is a flame or an idol or a mantra or a sound or an emotion or a sensation in the body, the wind touching the skin. That is one way. But then the trick is to notice the noticing. That the thought of Bibek has come to my mind, the remark Bibek made yesterday has come to my mind. Now that's one thought. But if I now direct the mind to noticing the fact that the thought of Bibek has come to my mind, then the noticing dissolves the thought of Bibek. I feel this is the third eye of Shiva. It is said that when that eye opens, वो हर एक चीज को भस्म कर देती है. It destroys, it burns out everything else. Precisely. So when we learn to notice what is coming up in the mind spontaneously, then those other things do not come up as frequently. That is a stage, that is a wonderful stage in meditation. And to see what is the thought by which other thoughts can be excluded, I am greatly enamored by Sri Ramana's emphasis on focusing and trying to perceive what he called the self. He said it is on the right side of the chest and so on. That is explained in the book. But look upon it as an abstraction and focus. And remember his remark at one stage when people were always asking him, what is this light? Is it a light? Is it a self? Is it does it have a form and so on? He says at one point that actually I have said this because focusing on the self will help you exclude other thoughts. So by focusing on the self or the emptiness in the mind after other thoughts have been excluded and focusing only on the empty mind and noticing if anything else is coming up or not is what I try to practice for about 45 minutes in the morning. The second lesson I've learned is that everything can be put to use for this purpose, for studying the reactions in the mind. If it's a loud sound, if it's a bird chirping, you notice that and then come back to the blank mind. Don't force it away. If there's an itch, do not try to rub your skin. Just notice it and come back to the empty mind. And that certainly helps. And one of the most interesting things that I found in the literature was actually given by a person, is advice given by a great teacher called Ajahn Sumedho, an American who became the disciple of Ajahn Chah, one of the great forest monks of Thailand, and then was asked to set up a monastery, Buddhist monastery in Sussex. He has said, notice the sound of silence. That if you do not hear anything at all times, between your ears there is something between a hum and a hiss. So focus on that sound of silence. I find that to be very helpful. It was very helpful to me in the ICU, because as I mentioned to you, it was such a noisy place, but I could always retreat to that sound of silence. It's not something divine or anything, it may just be the blood in the inner capillaries, the capillaries around and the inner ear. So I'm not saying that, we have reached some stage or anything, but focusing on that is a wonderful thing, and it can be done. I've been able to focus on it in an MRI machine. In the MRI machine, as you know, you are bombarded with all sorts of random and piercing sounds. But I was able to retreat into the sound of silence, and the 40 minutes, the MRI machine, which sort of becomes very claustrophobic for many persons, was nothing from it, was just lying down for me. That was a wonderful thing. So focus on the empty mind, and secondly on this sound of silence are among the two that helped me a great deal.
I think there are several important things in what Mr. Shourie has just said. Some of them are actually not in the book. Yes, it is indeed true that the mind can only focus on one thing at a time. It should be very obvious, but it is normally not obvious to us. And the word mantra that Mr. Shourie used, mantra etymologically is something used to restrain the mind. The second thing that he said is again something that is so obvious that we don't appreciate it normally, is how dangerous, and I'm deliberately using the word dangerous, language has become. Language has been a great boon. It's enabled us to do various things, to communicate, to disseminate knowledge, to pass on knowledge to our offspring, and that's how humans evolved. But in the process, we are busy talking all the time. We are busy chatting all the time. We are busy writing all the time. We are busy conversing all the time. We don't spend time with ourselves, which is what silence is. And the more you shut off obvious senses like speech, obvious senses like sight, the more other senses tend to be heightened. So what Mr. Shourie has just spelled out on his practices of meditation are invaluable lessons. Let me now move on to something else which does not directly figure in the book. It does indirectly, but not directly. How do you react to the concept of time? What I mean by that is, in a Western sense, we have a very linear view of time. This happened in the past, this will happen in the future, we are sitting here in the present, and therefore there is a causation. This happened in the past, therefore this is the result, and that caused this. But in many of the Eastern religions, the notion of time is that of circular flow, of the past and the present and the future converging, in fact, indeed coexisting. So any reaction to death is, I think, somewhat contingent on how we look at the question of time. Is time like this? Does it go round and round? Or is time a continuous flow with a neat past, a neat future? This is birth, this is death.
Vivek, I am not competent enough to say this. Firstly, on the first point that you made about meditation, that is the definition that Patanjali gives in this famous second sutra,
Yes.
Yoga with vritti nirodh. Wonderful thing that it is to stop the incessant chatter in the mind, exactly as you said. And these are all techniques for that. Focusing on the empty mind is one way, focusing on the sound of silence is one, and so on. Now, on the question of time, I'm not competent to comment at all. And while I've read about this business of circular notions of time, it is really not about time. It is about the sequence of events, that events repeat themselves. But they did happen in the past, and something will happen in the future. The idea of time is still something that goes from one end to the other. But it is that the events in time keep recurring again and again. So the notion is circular about the events, not about time. And secondly, as far as my limited understanding is concerned, or my feeling is concerned, I have the feeling of time being linear. So there is birth, there is death in that sense. About causation, which is separate from the question of time, yes, I think that the Buddhist notion of interdependence is much closer than of causation. Everything has a cause, but in Buddhism, the emphasis is on the multiplicity of causes that triggers a particular event. That we are talking to each other, or that I am now existing, is a result of a number of factors coming together. And when that togetherness, when they go apart, then whatever was happening, or whatever the person was, or whatever that material was, that it dissolves. This is of interdependence, of universal interdependence, of everything depending on everything else. So the causation is not just that I do something and therefore I get punished or rewarded, but a much wider concept. Actually, Indra's net is a better image of an infinite number of diamonds, each diamond reflecting all other infinite number of diamonds, as a metaphor as an image of causation than a linear causation. So just a slight difference, linearity not of time but of events, and secondly, causation not just of one direct overwhelming cause, but of a multiplicity of factors that result in something.
Okay, I guess at some point Sucheta would like to open it up to listeners also. I should not completely monopolize you in terms of asking questions. So let me ask a last question. How would you react to notions of karma and samsara? The reason I am asking this is you have quoted from Ramana Maharshi. He would have one approach to these two notions. You've also quoted the Buddha would have a slightly different response. How would Arun Shourie look at these two notions of karma and samsara?
Well, I think on karma, you see, I revolt against the conventional notion about karma, that whatever is the condition of let's say of my child. You say my book on the mother's heart was bitter, but actually I was not bitter when I was writing it. I believe that it is time and chance which are the two great demons that explain everything. So there's no point in being of railing against them. They will continue to, as the Bible says, happeneth to them all. Now, but to attribute his condition to karma is, I think, just convenient fiction, that he is born with an injury to his brain. So what is the explanation? People will say, नहीं, इसने कुछ ना कुछ पिछले जन्म में बुरा कर्म किया होगा. How do you know कि इसने पिछले जन्म में बुरा कर्म किया होगा? नहीं तो सर इसकी ये condition ना होती. Then that is circularity. It's not an explanation. It is what a German writer has called convenient fiction. So, and I have I do not revolt against, but I find it unacceptable, because it always ends up blaming the victim. If you see Gandhiji's explanations for Jews being sent into the gas chambers, well, they did not have love for Hitler in their heart. It almost amounts to that. So, or the earthquake in Bihar, which killed 30,000 persons at that time, he says is the punishment of God for the sin of untouchability. Now, untouchability is a sin, perfectly right. But whether the earthquake is a punishment, and the students in Bihar ask him when he goes there, that why did this not occur in the south, where there is more untouchability than here in Bihar? And he can't answer. So, this notion of karma as an explanation for my condition today, or my son's condition, or anybody's condition, is, I think, overdone. It in the end is a tautology and nothing more. But in the Buddhist sense, it is more that it is not just the overt deed which is done, but every thought. The greater emphasis is that on any thought that I might have, any word I speak, and not just the gross deed which I do, those are karma, and they leave etching on our minds, and that predisposes me to a particular line of action which will then make certain results more probable. In that sense, I think karma is absolutely right, and neuroscientists would agree with that, because it is said that the neurons that fire together, then the bonds become greater between those neurons, and that is the etchings on the mind that happen as a result of our thoughts or of our deeds. So, a more subtle appreciation of karma than just thinking of it as a cause for my current condition. On samsara, on this question of whether it is real or not, I really don't know. Even after all, Raman Maharishi and all these people who said that samsara is not real, the extreme Advaitins, they ate food. If the body is unreal, why do you eat food? Another unreal thing. If the person sitting in front of you do not exist, as some of Sri Ramana's statements would imply, that nobody is there, nobody was born, therefore how can anybody be dying? The world is unreal. Then it is not, then why would you be teaching? It is not in that sense that the samsara is unreal. It is much better to think of it as that it is samsara is not only what you see and experience. It is something more. then that's certainly the case. When I look at you, I'm not naturally my eyes are excluding a lot of the visual input that is coming in. So in that sense, it is much better to think of samsara not being real, being that it is not all that which is real is not only what I am perceiving through my senses. Then it is of course acceptable.
Okay, Sucheta, shall we throw this open? How does one handle this?
Yes, I think we will. In fact, we've completed 1 hour, so I'm going to just allow a couple of questions. But I've been looking at the questions on the chat, and one of the issues, I know that both you and Mr. Shourie differ on it, but a lot of people have asked about it, which is that the concept of death varies in different religions. And some believe in rebirth and others don't. I know that both of you are on different sides of the fence when it comes to rebirth. So can I ask both of you to respond to it? I mean, the concept of death and rebirth. So both you and Mr. Shourie.
Well, this is Mr. Shourie's book. In all fairness, you should ask Mr. Shourie to respond and leave me out of it. Again, if you force me.
Right.
It will give us a much better answer, but I certainly would look for evidence for rebirth rather than, that we sometimes hear of persons, of little children remembering their past births and so on. I feel that those cases should be pursued and examined thoroughly rather than just, taking them on faith, any account that comes to us, or rejecting account outright. But the best exchange on this, Bibek, that I heard about was from Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh said that he had been asking the Dalai Lama about rebirth. And to each thing that the Dalai Lama would say, Khushwant Singh would say something to the opposite extent, to the opposite effect. And the Dalai Lama would cite some case in Punjab or 2 girls, he would have some other explanation. This went on for 3-4 rounds. And then the Dalai Lama looked at him and said, "Look here, Mr. Singh, if I didn't believe in rebirth, I would be out of business." So Khushwant Singh said that ended the argument. Because actually we should look for evidence. We should not. It's not a matter of faith, whether you believe in rebirth or not. In my own view, it's one of the many concepts that have been devised for us to try and bring solace to ourselves that no, something in me will survive some way or the other and will be reborn. So death is not destruction. But in my very limited view, I find that yes, death is the end.
Would you like to respond to that?
No, let's not get into an argument over this. Evidence is a very, very subjective expression. There are different kinds of evidence. Many things we've been led to believe on the basis of evidence have subsequently been proved to be wrong. There is evidence fairly robust beyond the anecdotal on children, particularly from Sri Lanka. Why Sri Lanka, I don't know, but there's some fairly robust evidence for children from Sri Lanka. Having said this, in a simple statement, I do believe in rebirth.
Okay. One last question, I think, before we close, by Arun Bhaskar. Can I ask Bhaskar to unmute? This is part of Mr. Shourie's book. I think he's talked about his father and the concept of euthanasia, which I think Mr. Shourie, your father, also believed in. So I'll let Bhaskar ask the question and then ask you to answer.
Well, I wanted to avoid asking the question, Sucheta. But anyway, Gandhi believed in euthanasia. Strong. And if you believe in euthanasia, trouble is it's illegal. But were it legal, would it be right to take the life of someone who's incapable of looking after himself, or a person who's in tremendous pain? And it's a very sensitive, very delicate question, but this is something that we have to come to terms with sometime or the other. Do you want to believe in euthanasia or do you not believe in euthanasia?
So I think that's a very important question, and much work should be done on this matter. The matter should be thought through. Because, for instance, you said, if somebody is incapable of looking after himself, but is a person with cerebral palsy, like our son, is certainly incapable of looking after himself. I would certainly not believe that, yes, therefore, such a person should be put to death. So the point there is, similarly, you said if a person is in intense pain, but Vivek would remind us, and our life reminds us, that I may be in intense pain today, but through pain relievers and through other practices, I can overcome that pain tomorrow, or incurable, that extreme cancer which was gnawing at me is cured tomorrow. So the criteria have to be studied much more carefully than would be done by us laymen. We should leave it to neuroscientists. We should leave it to doctors. And there have been, there are special commissions on this question of when, for instance, there is a person brain dead. And brain death is now defined as the precondition for euthanasia. But what is brain death is again to be studied, because in the neuroscientific literature, you will find that persons who had been even in a vegetative state for months, in fact for 2 years, it was found that they had retained a residual awareness. And if Sucheta will give me 1 minute, I'll explain to you the way this was discovered. See, a lady is lying in a Belgian hospital. She, in a state of, in a vegetative state, it seems, because she was in a car crash. Now, she cannot answer your questions if you ask her, is this true, is this not true, because she's in a vegetative state. But it's been found that the brain can be imaged, and those neurons respond to playing tennis. If you imagine playing tennis, then the same neurons respond in the same way. If you think of walking in your house, the same neurons come into play as would come into play if you were actually walking in your house. So the neuroscientists did the imagery of the brain to see, asking that lady questions. If the answer is yes, imagine playing tennis. If the answer is no, imagine taking me through your house. So different sets of neurons will become active. And it turned out that she was able to answer questions. She answered questions, the answers to which only she knew. So they said, well, she's in a vegetative state, or a state of semi-awareness, but she has awareness. This was then later found in the case of heavy anesthesia. You give me anesthesia, you start the operation, but I am not completely unconscious. I feel the cuts. I feel the bone being sawn through. So this residual awareness is now leading experts to look at brain death much more closely. So the answer to Mr. Bhaskar's question about euthanasia is, yes, it should be legal, but the criteria on which a person's life is dictated has to be studied much more closely than we, I think, have done in India. Of course, Vivek would know more about this because he's in government. He would know what the government people have been studying. But I think that much more work is required on the criteria by which this is to be turned off. Because it is correct that once we make it legal, then many people, let's say, who are after the property of another person, can misuse misuse the law. Do not want that to happen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shourie. I think we've done more than 1 hour of the session today, and Bibek, you have covered everything that most people are asking. Can we close the session with closing comments from you and Mr. Shourie?
These are beautiful and interesting subjects, and we should dive into them and be like Bibek and write about them 100 books. But also, we should look upon these things with slightly less seriousness than we are apt to think because of the subject. And I'll end with that. This is a state secret which was discussed by my good friend Rajiv Mehrotra, who is, as you know, responsible for many of the activities of the foundation in Delhi. And he sent me a message saying that, do you know that the Dalai Lama recently sent an email to Xi Jinping, the ruler of China. And Xi Jinping said, an email from the Dalai Lama? So he at once opened it. And suddenly it said, see attachment. He said, he sent me a parental proposal. So he immediately clicked on the attachment. And then his computer, like my video, it crashed. And all the computers connected to his computer, the computers of the Central Committee of the Communist Party crashed. And then the computers of the generals of the PLA crashed. So Xi Jinping became furious. And he sent a telegram to the Dalai Lama. What damn thing are you doing? What is the meaning of all this? So the Dalai Lama sent him a telegram back. With attachment comes suffering. Good summary. It's a good way to look at a Buddhist teaching. Read about death and so on with a light heart. That was would that be an appropriate end, Sucheta?
I think so. Something to say. He was holding your book up. I think it's a fantastic way to end this.
Thank you.
Vivek, you were saying something?
No. I think that's a wonderful ending. One can't better that. All I want to say is this is a great book. This is a great book. It's a serious book. It needs to be read carefully. One needs to think about the issues that the book has raised. It's, as I said earlier, in my view, one of the best books Mr. Shourie has ever written.